The driving discussion has to be one of the major barriers to our willingness to open up the Pandora's box of dementia. There's no doubt about it. Particularly in a country as large as Australia, we are wedded to driving.
So it can be difficult and complex. It's particularly difficult in a rural area where there is poor or no public transport, because if you stop people driving, you actually are taking away a lot of their mobility in the community. So it's something that we need to think very carefully about.
It's really hard because it's like we're taking away their independence, or they think that we're going to take away their independence. And I've had patients that come in who do break down in tears and say, you know, I've just had my licence taken off me. Now what do I do?
And so immediately that we raise this question about driving capability, we threaten that person's independence.
A diagnosis of dementia does need to be notified. I can encourage the patient to see one of my colleagues in the practice to do the notification and word them up. Could you just do a driving review and say, no, they can't, and you're notified, but then you're the bad guy, not me, because that means that I can still be their primary caregiver. So sometimes broaching the driving issue, it does help if we have a geriatrician involved who can actually say to the patient and do the notification to Vic Roads.
I would much rather see me as the specialist being blamed for the driving withdrawal than my primary care colleague who has a long-term need for a relationship with the patient.
Diagnosis of dementia may be something to trigger a OT referral, but again, if you're in a regional area, they are really hard to get and they can be expensive.
We have to rely on OT driving assessment because that's really our only gold standard that we have. Difficult sometimes to access and expensive. If they can't access an OT driving assessment, then there are a couple of things that you can do to try and what I call trifurcate the population. So there's one population who's got a very poor MSE, they cannot complete a clock drawing test, their intersecting pentagons are poor, so their planning and their visuospatial function is poor, their MSE score is 19, and the family are worried they really shouldn't be driving. Then maybe you've got someone who's presented relatively early because they're busy and engaged with the local bowling club, they're secretary of the tennis club, and they look after grandchildren every day. You do their MMSE, they've lost 3 points because their memory's poor, but their visuospatial function's fine, their clock drawing test is fine. Then, if they're physically well and they can move their head, they don't have any visual disturbance, and there's never been any concern about driving, I actually write on, there's a recommendation in the Ausroads that can say, well, look, I think someone should have a conditional licence, but I think they should be allowed to drive. And I think if the diagnosis or the etiology of their dementia is the Alzheimer's disease most likely, or maybe vascular, then I'm very happy for them to be driving. In Lewy body dementia, where the predominant abnormality is in the occipital cortex and visuospatial function, I think we have to be a bit more careful. The population in the middle, which probably is, to be honest, is still going to be 60% of the population, it's very difficult to judge, and you're going to rely a lot on in what area the person's driving. But if they're sensible enough to stay local and not drive in the dusk and not drive at dawn, but then raise that with those around them who are important and say, gee, I'm a little bit worried. So in the end, unfortunately, dementia is one of those conditions that affects driving. 98% of the population with dementia will actually stop driving at the right time and will be accepting of that. It's a relatively small proportion of the population with dementia, particularly if they've got significant frontal or subcortical injury, who will struggle with the withdrawal of driving.
We are empathetic to the fact that they can no longer drive, and that can be really hard for patients. So it's understanding them and supporting them through that journey.
I would certainly encourage them to use friends and family, and then the volunteer driving services.
We do encourage them to access taxis if that's something that's feasible for them, or finding out whether they've got neighbours that they can call upon. Or it might even be that they're living in a retirement village and there's buses that can bring them into town.
When managing dementia as a chronic disease, it's about managing the person, about managing their illness, about managing their other illnesses, and about assisting their family, but also about helping them to stay engaged within their community.